It's a very great pleasure for me today to welcome and to introduce Dr. Carys Moseley, who's going to come in a minute. Carys studied classics at the University of Cambridge and theology at the universities of Oxford and Edinburgh. She held a research post in academic theology at Edinburgh, where she also taught Christian theology and ethics. She currently works in public policy research in the at Christian Concern in the United Kingdom. She's contributed to the IFTCC response document, which we hope to make available to you and which is online and which is available on the homepage right now if you'd like to check it out. And she's going to lead us through the document.
Well, good afternoon. I'm very honored to be here to speak on behalf of Christian Concern, and I'm a public policy research analyst for them. It seems strange that the topic of psychotherapy should have become a matter for public policy. But this is why I'm here, of course, to shed some light on the history and ethics around this therapy, as we try to do in the document that you can see before you and that's online. So I'm going to start by talking about the therapeutic tradition in the United Kingdom, and I make a hint of that in the document. Psychotherapy for unwanted same-sex attraction and gender confusion has been practiced in the United Kingdom for a century or so now, with varying levels of success. That's not very well known. It's certainly true that case studies have been recorded, and I shall say a little more about this matter later. Several of the most eminent and respected therapists have been involved at one time or another in this work. I've been looking into the evidence, and I'm working on writing a historical account of treatment, with special attention to the philosophical and moral issues involved. It's fair to call psychotherapy not only a discipline, but a secular tradition by now, with its own major thinkers, practitioners, and also critics. It has become important for Christians working in pastoral work, whether as ordained or lay persons, to have some acquaintance with this field, though often this is more via learning counseling skills. The relationship between Christian theology and psychotherapy and psychology has not always been an easy one. At present, the relationship of psychotherapy with reality has been stretched to breaking point in the United Kingdom, thanks to the publication of the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapies, signed by most major mental health bodies, as well as by NHS England and NHS Scotland. The memorandum bans not only all therapy to reduce same-sex attraction and increase heterosexual attraction, regardless of the client's wishes and also without regard for age. It also bans all therapy aimed at helping clients who experience any degree of transgender identification to live in harmony with their biological sex. The words man and woman and male and female no longer mean anything to most mental health bodies in the UK, and as such, psychotherapy for sexual problems has become incoherent. It really is the case that the time of the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counselling Choice has come. Did you know, for example, that the UK Council for Psychotherapy, one of the first to sign up to the memorandum, announced as far back as 2010 that we do not know how either heterosexuality or homosexuality originates. This was in response to unspecified comments about the memorandum, banning professional members from offering this kind of therapy. This really is an insult to the intelligence, a serious blow to the credibility of the professional body in question. Now, the government is supporting a ban, having first said so via the LGBT news site Pink News, which reported in March this year that the Home Office was considering a ban. I don't think that was a coincidence. It was soon after Voices of the Silenced was screened. And I also wrote an article for Christian Concern talking about the research that Mike had made on public opinion, that it didn't support a ban. Our opponents read what we put out there. They know that people can change and move away from same-sex attraction and behavior. They know there is evidence for this. Their only weapon, therefore, is censorship and intimidation tactics. It's one thing for LGBT campaigners to insist on a ban. They've been doing this for 50 years. It's quite another thing for the present government to be so cowardly as to actually give in to their demands. In proposing a ban on therapy, the UK government has ripped up the moral compromise between the vast majority of people who disapproved of same-sex relations and were concerned about the effect on people, and those who tolerated and even approved them. And that compromise was in the Wolfenden Report of 1957, and it was put on a statutory footing by the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. The fact of the matter is that the Wolfenden Report's recommendation of the decriminalisation of homosexual acts between consenting adult men over the age of 21 was in fact predicated upon acceptance of the therapeutic treatment of homosexuality. Of the witnesses who appeared before the Wolfenden Committee, the psychotherapists were in favour of decriminalisation, but most other witnesses, including criminal justice professionals, were not. And the Conservative government of the day was not in favour, and neither was the public. The archives of the Wolfenden Committee, which are available in the National Archives in Kew, and I've been looking through those, clearly show that therapists, as well as psychiatrists, were asked a lot of questions about change, okay? And they were able to answer affirmatively in varying degrees. So here's some of the evidence, and this is in the document. The witnesses were among the most eminent and well-regarded in the psychological professions in their day in Britain. They included people who talked about their own clients, of course. So H.V. Dix from the Tavistock Clinic, John Kellnar from the Tavistock Clinic, Clifford Allen, Eustace Chesser, T.C.N. Gibbons from the Institute of Psychiatry, William Gillespie from the Institute of Psychoanalysis, Elliot Jacques from the Institute of Psychoanalysis, Wilfred Byron from the London Clinic of Psychoanalysis, a Dr. Harris from the Royal Medico-Psychological Society, which is actually now the Royal College of Psychiatry, and a Dr. Hobson from the same society, and Winifred Rushforth from the Davidson Clinic in Edinburgh. 60 years later, the UK government is unwilling to listen to any practitioners in psychotherapy dealing with these issues or their supporters, having chosen instead only to listen to gay male activists preoccupied with criminalising therapy. This is despite the fact that there is evidence for the benefit being published internationally. So if we turn to the survey, there's a disingenuous definition of conversion therapies, okay? Section 5.7, so-called conversion therapies, sometimes also referred to as cure, aversion, or reparative therapies, are techniques intended to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. These techniques can take many forms and commonly range from pseudo-psychological treatments to spiritual counselling. In extreme cases, they may also include surgical and hormonal interventions, or even so-called corrective rape. Respondents were asked whether they had ever undergone or been offered any such intervention, and if so, who had conducted or offered it. This was said in the report after the survey, okay? Now there's a discrepancy between the report on the survey and the original questionnaire. The questionnaire has been published in Annex 2 of the report. It doesn't define conversion therapy in this way. It doesn't claim that surgical and hormonal treatments or corrective rape are types of therapy. Questions 142 to 145 if you want to go into the questionnaire. Such a discrepancy between the content of survey questions for members of the public and the content of the official report based on the responses is disturbingly unempirical and ethically unacceptable. It suggests that respondents were misled as to the true motivations of the government in asking such questions. But when the survey opened in July 2017, the government had not stated that it would ban therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction. By the way, I also made a Freedom of Information request to the Government Equalities Office about this business of corrective rape. I asked specifically, did they have any evidence that a therapist working on sexuality in the United Kingdom had ever recommended this as treatment? And under the Freedom of Information law, they had to reply to me, and they admitted that they had not. So effectively, they were lying, and this was said in Parliament, and therefore Parliament was arguably misled. Because the jurisdiction of any law that would be passed on this could only extend across the United Kingdom, and if there are no cases of what they're talking about, it's irrelevant. Also, most former clients were non-religious, and this is very important because we're an eclectic collection of people. There is a table in the survey report indicating the religion or belief of respondents who said they had therapy. Although the table showed that Muslim and Hindu respondents were the most likely to have had therapy, and you check them against population stats, the single largest group were those of no religion, 1.5% of the non-religious respondents. And this was then followed by Christians. Okay, and remember that official statistics show religion in terms of affiliation only, which is very loose. It's sort of a cultural attachment to religion. Now, this is interesting. It echoes the findings of a well-known paper published in 2009 by 3 gay activists, which found that only 7% of clients were reported to be primarily motivated by religious concerns. Okay? Most are motivated by intrinsic concerns, with confusion about sexual orientation at the top of the list, 57%. And also, only 15% of that sample were motivated by social pressures, including family. This scuppers the claim that therapy is inherently coercive. All in all, it's fair to say that ex-gays are presumed non-existent. Okay? So when the survey asked people's sexual orientation and gender identity, it provided no tick box option for ex-gay, even though many clients who have undergone therapy due to being unhappy would subsequently call themselves ex-gays. So much about the survey. I want to move on to the human rights dimension. Well, the triumph of legalism, but I'll go from that into the human rights dimension. Unless we've skipped. Right, that's fine, that is not a problem. You'll see on the next slide, there's a photo of Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. You'll see why he's relevant. He was the Home Secretary who commissioned the Wolfenden Report in 1954, and Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister. Maxwell Fyfe, as well known, was deeply concerned about the blackmailing of homosexual men close to the government by the KGB. He had already had a distinguished legal career, having been one of the judges in the Nuremberg trials. As a result of this, he helped draft the European Convention on Human Rights, which was published in 1951, and to which the United Kingdom is a signatory. Unfortunately, due to a combination of strategic litigation by progressive activists and judicial activism by irresponsible members of the legal profession, often judges, the meaning of several of the articles of the Convention have been seriously distorted during the past quarter century. Nevertheless, the Convention has been enshrined in our laws in the Human Rights Act, and as such, it is vital to make use of it, interpret it properly, to defend this field of therapy from any and every possible attack on all sides. It is deeply ironic that it is the Home Office, albeit under the watch of Amber Rudd at the time, who was no longer Home Secretary, that was said to favour a ban. We do not know the views of the present Home Secretary on the matter. Now to this point about the triumph of legalism. Of course, the therapy consists of talking, so it cannot be a hate crime, because for something to be a hate crime, it has to be a violent crime. But it could be maliciously reported as a hate incident by opponents. In the world of hate crime studies and the sort of vagueness that's being created, disagreement and disapproval can be interpreted as hate. And telling the truth about who is male or female can also be interpreted as hate in today's climate. This nonsense is allowed to continue because not enough people really understand this distinction between hate crime and hate speech, and so it's permeated the public sphere. But also because hate crime laws and their legacy have represented the triumph of legalism in the Western world. Legalism here means the attempt to legislate about how people feel or should feel about certain things. Homosexuality and transsexualism or transgenderism is my topic today. The problem with legalism is that it attempts to punish thoughts rather than only actions. It also introduces inequality before the law by giving harsher penalties to criminals depending on the characteristics of their victims. This is supposed to be an educational deterrent to criminals not to attack certain kinds of people by using certain kinds of words. Of course, this doesn't really work. Hardened criminals of this sort who actually violently attack others don't really care about the niceties of language. The real purpose of this concept of hate crime and hate incident and hate speech is to criminalize objections to homosexual lifestyle, even compassionate and critical ones. All this bullying thinking has been incorporated into the counter-extremism strategy of the government. But before I discuss that, I'll go into more detail on the human rights dimension. So there's Maxwell 5 for you. There's a proposed ban on counselling and therapy would, in our view, a Christian concern, violate the European Convention on Human Rights. It would be a sex discrimination, violation of Article 14. Why? We're thinking about transgenderism for a minute. For someone to go down that path of an alternative gender identity means moving away from living and being known as a member of their sex. The Memorandum of Understanding, as I said earlier, imposes no lower age limit on clients, so it's a threat to vulnerable and impressionable children and teenagers, as well as to vulnerable adults, including those with undiagnosed psychiatric conditions and learning difficulties. Such people could be manipulated and are manipulated into a transgender or non-binary identification, and as such have their sex-based dignity and rights violated. Discrimination against ex-LGBT people, ex-gays, detransitioners, whatever term you want to use, a violation of Article 14 under other status. Thanks to the legal casework of the Christian Legal Centre, on behalf of Core Issues Trust, ex-gays are protected characteristic in the common law under the Equality Act of 2010. And you could say that is a sexual identity, meaning it's a social descriptor used by the individual concerning him or herself as regards leaving behind gay or lesbian identity, attraction, and behaviour. It's also obviously an attack on freedom of speech to try to ban therapy, a violation of Article 9 on freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Therapeutic conversations are private and confidential, though may occur either in the public sector or the private sector. Banning therapy would violate freedom of speech of both clients and therapists, as well as third parties such as supervisors of therapists. It's an attack on freedom of expression, violation of Article 10. Restriction on therapy would count as an attack on freedom of expression of the individual client, the counsellor or therapist, his or her supervisor, any course lecturers, tutors or facilitators, the freedom of expression of family members of the client if they came for couple therapy or family therapy. Also under Article 10, an attack on academic freedom, which is the freedom to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. A ban on therapy would erode academic freedom regarding this entire field, affecting researchers, educationalists, and students. It would be an attack on freedom of assembly and association, Article 11. Restriction of therapy is an attack on the freedom of assembly, including organisation of conferences such as this one, training events, group therapy, educational events, press conferences, showings of films and plays. We've already seen that with Voices of the Silenced. It would be an attack on freedom of conscience, returning to Article 9. Many people choose to seek therapy to move away from LGBT identification for reasons of conscience. Remember I mentioned non-religious clients. Many professionals in this field are also following their conscience in providing such services. An attack on the right to respect for private and family life, according to Article 8. Now, the original intent of the right to respect for private and family life was to protect the individual from unwarranted state surveillance. Many counsellors and therapists work from their own homes, and they may be self-employed. Other therapists may work over the internet or the telephone or use email. In order to be effective, a ban on counselling and psychotherapy would have to entail restrictions on therapists' use of the internet, phone, and all other means of electronic and remote communication, as well as interference with these to detect therapeutic activity. The UK Council for Psychotherapy says on its website that if members of the public are aware that conversion therapy is taking place, they should make a complaint. Members of the public are asked to snitch on private conversations about sex. This is insane. This is unacceptable. It's an attack on the right to marry, Article 12. Some people want therapy in order to feel they're ready to pursue their personal life goal of marriage. As such, any restriction on therapies for unwanted same-sex attraction and gender identities would constitute a violation of the client's right to marry. And it could affect things like marriage preparation. Attack on religious freedom, Article 9. Some clients belong or are affiliated to a religion. Their religious beliefs and commitments may be of help to them with these intrinsic desires in moving out of former identities they no longer want, or in stopping them from moving in. And they may seek out professionals who are willing to respect their religious commitment in the therapeutic relationship. Is this therapy non-violent extremism? If you read Christian Concern's website, you'll have seen that I've written on this. And I think it's important that I just finish by talking about this, okay? The very fact that the Home Office was said to consider a ban, made it very clear therapy was now possibly considered as a form of extremism, for the Home Office is responsible for the counter-extremism strategy. And of course, hate crime comes under that. This bright idea was hatched by Theresa May in her role as Home Secretary and launched on the 19th of October 2015. Speaking at the Pink News Awards on the 27th of October 2015, Nicky Morgan, then Education Secretary, demanded that, quote, gay cure therapy, as she calls it, should be stamped out. In the same breath, she said that the Prime Minister promised to, quote, do more to tackle non-violent extremism that encourages intolerance and hatred towards LGBT people. Remember that this speech was delivered barely a week after the government launched the strategy. Then we have the Casey Review on Integration, Dame Louise Casey, neither a therapist nor a clergy person or a theologian. She published a review in December 2016 and clearly framed traditional attitudes to various things such as homosexuality as extremist and as opposed to British values. For example, I quote, there is evidence that some people, in particular ethnic and faith communities, have views around lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people that are at odds with the mainstream modern British values and laws. Such views are frequently ascribed to more hardline and extreme individuals in those communities. Then she says, there are examples of inequality and intolerance in other ethnic and faith groups, with concerns expressed to us during the review about newer Christian churches, with activists seeking to, quote, cure people of homosexuality. All such instances undermine integration and should be challenged. So by that token, the Wolfenden report was extremist. The Commission for Countering Extremism, a few weeks ago, was looking for victims of extremism. On the 20th of September this year, the Commission published the terms of reference for its study on extremism and how to challenge extremism more effectively. Well, good luck with that, because there isn't one single definition of it, but never mind. Don't let the facts get away for good argument. Alongside victims of terrorism, the Commission claimed that there are other victims of extremism as follows. And it says, we heard about gay people forced to choose between living their lives as they want and their faith, and suffering abuse as a result, and the abuse faced by people countering extremism affecting their emotional and psychological well-being. Given that Nicky Morgan and Louise Casey both attacked what they call gay cure as extremism, it is reasonable to suppose that it is a covert reference to it here in the Commission's statement. It doesn't matter that counsellors and therapists do not and cannot force anybody to do anything or say anything, nor they do not consider homosexuality a mental illness. So you can't say cure. Government propaganda is clearly built upon the assumption that everybody who encounters counselling and therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction must be somebody who actually willingly claims an LGBT identity. The difference between attraction and identity, right? The government, therefore, deliberately denies the very existence of ex-gays once again. So there we have it. The present government clearly considers this therapy to be a form of extremism, but never quite get round to saying just that. The truth is that this represents a complete moral inversion as regards the therapeutic tradition in the United Kingdom. For let's remember that psychoanalytic psychotherapy, the original form of psychotherapy, started with Jews in Vienna, secularized, assimilated Jewish people at the turn of the 20th century, and spread to London in the 1920s. In 1938, Sigmund Freud, his daughter Anna Freud, and several other prominent Jewish psychotherapists had to flee the Nazi regime in Germany and Austria. They came to London and they came to New York in the USA. Many of these treated clients with unwanted same-sex attraction. Their contributions were key to the field. They've been written up. Indeed, one of the witnesses before the Wolfenden Committee was also an expert on totalitarian regimes in Europe, what today might be called political extremism. But I'll finish with one piece of good news, given that we're dealing also with gender identity problems. Penny Mordaunt, who is the Minister for Women and Equalities, had actually repeated this nonsense about corrective rape to Parliament. She's now being forced to backtrack on her prior enthusiasm for making gender change easier. And that was this weekend. Okay? And she had been quoted a few days earlier in the press talking about extremists on both sides, but that issue as well. Again, the rhetoric of extremism is being used. And it means anybody who criticizes the government. Okay? But most people don't want to be made to lie or to deceive others or to hide deep concerns about sexuality and sexual embodiment. And so to round off, I'd like to say the International Federation exists to help people with all these problems with same-sex attraction and gender identity. And the best remedy to a threat to free speech, such as a clearly malicious one that we are facing, is to continue to speak out, speak with each other, speak to the government, speak to society. So long live the IFTCC.